The Crimean War could have been a crucial war for the future of Europe, and of course it was. Yet, the peace deal we got was quite disappointing. The most territory exchanged was a minor region of Bessarabia, which Russia had seized and was now returned to Moldova. Wow! The Romanian principalities, which were the most fought over during this war, were simply returned to nominal Ottoman rule, though, in practice, they were now basically independent. All in all, this wasn't really the crushing defeat for Russian expansionism like many people had hoped. Sure, the Russians were forced to remove any war fleets or fortifications from the Black Sea, but the Ottomans had to do that as well. So, when Russia was finally ready for a round 2 and led a new conflict against the Ottomans, the Turks were completely destroyed anyways. So, with the peace deal being this tame, it raises the question: what did the great powers want from this conflict, and which alternate treaties might we imagine? Let's start with the big boy themselves, Russia. Here, we immediately run into a big issue. Russia never clearly defined their vision on a peace deal. Depending on who you ask, Russia may have simply desired to protect the Christians of the Ottoman Empire, meaning giving Russia more privileges within these territories and perhaps some border adjustments. Tsar Nicholas seems to have realized that demanding too much would have likely resulted in a major anti-Russian coalition. To this effect, he made many promises before going to war to prevent exactly this. For example, Russia felt comfortable promising Britain they wouldn't annex Constantinople, or any Balkan territory for that matter. To further buy British neutrality, the Russians wanted to offer them Crete and a protectorate over Egypt. In such a scenario, Russian gains in the war would be minor, likely a protectorate over Romania, as this isn't technically taking Balkan territory, as well as some territory in Anatolia. Something along these lines would be the minimum of Russia's desires in this war. But that's the minimum. Gains like these would entail a minor conflict and thus minor spoils. But Russia's long-term goal, and the one they would have implemented if the other great powers didn't intervene at all, would work towards a singular goal: the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. The long-term vision from Russia would look something like this. The Danubian principalities and northern Bulgaria would be directly annexed into Russia. Southern Bulgaria and Serbia would then be created as independent states, though obviously under Russian influence. To compensate Austria, they were to gain Bosnia, Montenegro, and potentially Albania too. To keep Britain happy, they would get Egypt, as well as several islands in the eastern Mediterranean. The French would gain Crete for their cooperation. The remaining Balkan territory would then likely be granted to Greece. Over in Anatolia then, Russia would gain most of the Orthodox and Armenian territories. Then finally, as the crown jewel in the peace treaty, both sides of the Bosphorus would be directly taken by Russia. Now of course, such a future is completely unacceptable and would see most of Europe unite against the Russians. Yet, this would be the goal for Russia, not necessarily in this one war, but in the long term. Next up, let's discuss the nation under attack, the Ottomans. Their aims are very easily definable: halt the process of getting slowly carved up by the Europeans. Their immediate concern wasn't necessarily to regain major tracts of land from the Russians to restore their former glory. Though, if they could, gains in Bessarabia, restoring a more defendable border, and minor territories in the Caucasus would likely be accepted. But further gains, like Crimea or surrounding territories, would by this point be a pipe dream for the Ottomans, needlessly antagonizing the Russians for territories they couldn't really defend anyways. By this point, Russia had twice the Ottoman population and was even further ahead in military power. This war was about survival, not conquest for the Turks. Territorial integrity was the goal, not territorial expansion. In pursuit of this, the Ottomans would greatly benefit from removing Russia's role as the protector of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. This role gave Russia an easy excuse for war basically whenever they wanted. Internationally, the Ottomans would seek continued French, British, and other great power guarantees of their integrity. to ensure that the next time Russia tries something like this, they would again be opposed. To this end, the Ottomans sought to join the existing great powers of Europe as a recognized great power themselves. This way, the Ottomans would be more capable of steering European policy against Russian expansion and would be compensated when others expanded in the interest of defending the balance of power. In the end, the Ottomans got very little of their goals. Only minor territory changed hands, and Romania had practically become independent. While the great powers did promise to uphold their territorial integrity, when Russia started a new conflict in 1877, nobody would stop them, and any pretense about Ottoman relevance was crushed. So those are the two main participants. But the war really started because of Napoleon III, the newly self-crowned Emperor of France. Now Napoleon III, as you may have guessed, is family of the original Napoleon. As such, he had a major chip on his shoulder. His uncle had once subjugated Europe, turning France into one of the most powerful nations on earth. Napoleon III would seek to increase French prestige while proving he was worthy of his uncle's name. To this end, France went to the Christians and bribed and threatened them to declare France the defender of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire, taking the title away from the Russians. For Tsar Nicholas, this was completely unacceptable, and this French-Russian-Ottoman diplomatic spat is what would start the initial hostilities of the war. For Napoleon III, this was perfect. Not only could he now jump in to defend the Ottomans, as well as gaining the title of Defender of the Christians, he could also do what his uncle couldn't and defeat the Russians, avenging Napoleon's defeat. Besides that, territorially, France had few goals. Sure, the broad strengthening of the Ottomans was great, as France, like most major powers, did fear the rise of Russia. It also seemed that Napoleon III wanted to mimic his uncle by restoring an independent Polish state, undoubtedly to then become reliant on the French for defense and potentially to be used to further weaken the great powers surrounding it. But really, all of these territorial goals were secondary to the prestige that France desired. When the war was turning long and the Allies had struggled in Crimea for years, the fort of Sevastopol would finally fall. With this military capture under his belt, Napoleon III was more than happy to declare victory and would move the Allies towards making a peace deal. When the time came to discuss this peace, Napoleon III didn't care to support any harsh measures on Russia, a big reason for the mild treaty that we saw in our timeline. But one nation that did want to continue the war to a harsher conclusion was Britain, or at least their newly turned Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston. We will first go through general British hopes for the war, and then the specific aims of Lord Palmerston himself. In terms of general goals, weakening the Russians was by far the greatest one. They had been pushing into Central Asia, which was a worrying trend, which could soon see Russia in a position to threaten British India. Completely unacceptable. This fear of Russia would spread to Europe too. The Ottomans were seen as the buffer between Russia and the Mediterranean. Should they be allowed to achieve their goals for the Ottoman Empire, Russia could become a rival to British hegemony in the Mediterranean. As such, British goals were quite simple. Strengthen the Ottomans, possibly by giving them more territory than they may have even wanted, but more specifically, it was important to cripple Russia's ability to field a serious Black Sea navy. For example, the loss of Crimea to the Ottomans could destroy Russian power projection into the Black Sea, at least for the foreseeable future. Without a significant navy, Britain wouldn't have to worry so much about Russian ambitions on the Bosphorus. But Lord Palmerston had even greater ambitions, though they were fueled by the same fundamental goal of weakening the Russians. Palmerston had hoped that the fall of Sevastopol to the Allied forces, combined with the worsening economic situation of Russia, could be used to permanently devastate the Eastern Giant. He attempted to get Prussia and maybe Sweden into the conflict, as well as the Austrians, forming a massive anti-Russia coalition. The overwhelming power of such a coalition would bring even Russia to the negotiating table. allowing Palmerston to reshape Europe to the benefit of Britain. Sweden would be awarded Finland. This would weaken Russia and make Sweden motivated to break their neutrality and cooperate in future anti-Russian activities. The Prussians would be rewarded with significant Baltic territories, though the exact borders aren't defined yet. To appease the French, a Kingdom of Poland would also be created, though if he was satisfied with a small Poland or had something more radical in mind, we do not know. But considering that punishing Russia was the big goal here, we can expect him to go for something like this. But the peace deal is about to get even crazier. Austria would have to vacate northern Italy. These territories would then probably go to Sardinia-Piedmont, an ally during the Crimean War. Palmerston undoubtedly hoped that a strong North Italian state could counterbalance French and Austrian influence. But Austria had supported the British. Why would they ever accept this? Well, they would be compensated with Romania, up to the mouth of the Danube. This way, Austria could stand as a buffer between future Russo-Turkic conflicts. Finally, the Ottomans would be expanded massively, including Crimea. Now, I am sure that most of you already see the many issues with this peace deal. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all my releases, consider doing so. Thank you. So, let's run through the issues real quick. First, Sweden wouldn't likely want Finland, because this would place them squarely on the path of future conflict with Russia. The Prussian Baltic territories may be possible, but depending on just how big the newly created Polish state is, it would be completely undefendable in a future war against the Russians. Not to mention that any form of a Polish state would be unacceptable to the allied powers of Prussia and Austria. The only way I might see Poland happening is if it falls very strongly within Austria's control, though this defeats the purpose of creating an independent Polish state. Then Austria's northern Italian territories are quite literally the richest in their entire empire. Giving them up after winning a war is a crazy concept, especially considering the minor states in Italy were also very much under Austrian influence. Should this peace deal come into effect, they would be defenseless against the Sardinians later. Austria's gains in Romania then are nowhere near enough to compensate for these losses in Italy. Then finally, we have Ottoman expansion. Crimea is basically undefendable for the Ottomans in the face of future Russian attacks. Circassia is even worse. The Ottomans at their peak couldn't control this territory, and the Russians hadn't even managed, despite trying, for the last century. I highly doubt that the Ottomans can manage what the Russians couldn't, making the peace deal even worse. So, all in all, Palmerston's vision is a mess of a peace deal most powers wouldn't agree to, turning Russia into an even more aggressive power angry at the world, which would very likely ruin the balance of power. But perhaps the worst part is that, besides Crimea, Russia didn't even lose that many people or that much of their former military and economic power. But if you're interested, I will release a full video on what if this peace deal actually happened this Saturday. Anyways, let's move on to the final actual participant of the war, the small and unexpected Sardinia-Piedmont. This small state had enthusiastically joined the British and the French, and performed admirably during the fighting. But what could a small Italian state possibly hope to gain from fighting a war in Crimea? Well, I dare say that they cared the least about defending the Ottomans, or even about weakening the Russians. They had a far simpler goal: gain the favor of the British and the French. By doing so, Sardinia hoped to gain their support in defeating the Austrians and work towards a unified Italy. Perhaps surprisingly, this makes Sardinia-Piedmont the only state to actually achieve their goals in the war. Only 3 years after the Crimean War, the French would join the Sardinians in defeating the Austrians. This would allow them to annex Austrian Lombardia, as well as gain influence over all of central Italy, setting Sardinia up for Italian unification. So this covers the actual war participants, but we still have 2 more powers to discuss. Austria and Prussia both had their own opinions and interests during the war. We have seen that Palmerston expected both of them to join the conflict, but neither really had a serious interest in doing so. For France and Britain, they were fighting a war of luxury. They sent a limited number of soldiers to Crimea to fight on Ottoman and Russian soil. Should these efforts be defeated, the Ottomans stand to lose territory, not them. This is not the case for the Germanic great powers, which undoubtedly impacted their neutrality. Russia had more than 10 times the active forces of Prussia and about 5 times the forces of Austria. Austria specifically would be hard to convince. Even as the war was actively being fought, most of the Russian forces remained on the Austrian border, poised to strike if the Austrians did indeed join the war. In the case of either, or even both of the German states joining the war, it won't be millions of French and Brits dying on the front lines, it will be millions of Prussians and Austrians. But despite not getting involved, both still had goals. Most notably, Austria was a key player during the Crimean War. Only a few years ago, during the revolutions of 1848, the Habsburg Empire was at serious risk of collapse due to a Hungarian revolution as well as an Italian one. Arguably, Austria was only saved by hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers breaking this Hungarian revolt. As such, Russia had expected the Austrians to support them against the Ottomans, at the very least diplomatically. Russia had even wanted to grant Austria Bosnia in exchange for their support. But not only did Austria not support the Russians, the Austrians actively encouraged the French and British interventions. When the Russians retreated from Romania to focus on the now extended war, Austria would move in to protect them. So, what was Austria's motivation for this diplomatic maneuvering? Well, they too feared Russian domination over the Balkan. Sure, they would get Bosnia, maybe Montenegro, but that wouldn't really compare to the gains that Russia was trying to make. If Russian plans for the Balkan were successful, there was quite little room for Austrian expansion left. So, best case scenario for Austria during this war, Russia was held back and weakened, but more importantly, Austria could use the confusion to build out their occupation of the Danubian principalities, with Austria planning to annex the region fully, or at least turn them into puppet regimes. This would then greatly improve their position for future Ottoman weakenings. That leads us to the aims of the only truly neutral great power, Prussia. Their main goal was, quite simply, neutrality. While weakening Russia is probably something that might appeal to the Prussians, they had no interest in intervening to make this happen. With Britain blockading much of Russia's trade, Prussia was making a lot of money exporting resources to the Russians. Remaining neutral and making money while avoiding the devastation of war was quite simply the logical choice. This also wasn't yet the time for major Prussian plans for eastern expansion. In fact, taking significant territories from Russia would quite likely be terrible for Prussia's future. These territories, in the short term, would do little to strengthen the Prussians. But, assuming that Prussia does ever seek a conflict against the French or the Austrians, you can be sure that Russia either gets involved on the side of the attacked or demands that Prussia return these territories to save their neutrality. For Prussia, fighting a costly, major war now, only to make Russia into a permanent enemy, was not something they were interested in. So, neutrality was chosen. So, those are the goals of the great powers during the Crimean War. Safe to say that nobody, apart from Sardinia and Prussia, actually got what they wanted. By the end of the conflict, all that had really changed was a minor expansion of the Ottoman state, but through the loss of influence over Romania, even the Ottomans were basically weaker than before. Russia no longer being allowed to field a war navy on the Black Sea may have been great, giving the Ottomans the potential for a major edge in future conflicts by dominating the Black Sea, but the British forced both sides to demilitarize the sea. When the Prussians managed to defeat the French in 1871, the Russians would simply denounce the results of the Crimean War, and by 1877, Russia went back in for revenge. And this war proved how little was done to actually save the Ottomans from the Russians long term. The Ottoman Balkan would be completely devastated, and their future demise was practically secured. But that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment, as well as subscribing to the channel. If you enjoyed this video, click on the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you for watching, and goodbye.